Imagine you're with a group of friends under a blanket, maybe even with a bowl of popcorn, yelling at some ill fated character not to open that door. However, they do open that door, and one of your friends jumps, maybe even lets out a small yelp as some killer or supernatural being is revealed. This is generally what comes to mind for most when thinking of a horror movie, but not all horror takes this form.
Hello, my name is Blade, and let's talk about Longlegs and I Saw the TV Glow. Longlegs is a 2024 film directed by Oz Perkins and distributed by Neon. The film follows FBI agent Lee Harker as she attempts to unravel the mysterious string of murders committed by a serial killer known as Longlegs. The narrative is mysterious and puzzling in nature as we try to decode the perplexing circumstances in which these murders took place and the growing connection Lee seems to have to Longlegs. On the other hand, I Saw the TV Glow is completely different in tone. I Saw the TV Glow is directed by Jane Schoenbrun and distributed by A24. This film tells the story of Owen, who we meet as a child, just before he is introduced to an older schoolmate, Maddie. Owen and Maddie bond over a seemingly niche teen horror series titled The Pink Opaque. Maddie eventually runs away before reappearing when Owen is a young adult, claiming to him that they are in a false reality, suffering a dark fate, and furthermore, actually the two main characters featured in The Pink Opaque. Whether this is true or not is left ambiguous to the audience. Two very different films. So, what do they have in common? Well, besides both films having a strong visual aesthetic, during 2024, each of these films became the topic of internet discourse during their theatrical release on whether or not they should be considered horror films. More specifically, Longlegs came under scrutiny for not being scary enough, but wasn't totally rejected as a horror film, while I Saw the TV Glow was totally rejected as a horror film to some. This begs the question, what is horror? And does horror have to be objectively scary to be considered a valid piece of horror media?
Slashers, hauntings, body horror, death games, and demonic beings. These are all examples of face value horror, types of horror that you know are horror. For most films under these subgenres, and a few others as well, there's no questioning or debate on their horror status. For other films, though, they are brought to the debate room floor to challenge why they've been given the horror label.
Some reasons for discrediting their status as a horror movie include it's not scary enough, there wasn't enough blood, or, the most arbitrary of all the arguments, it was boring. Now, boringness aside, these types of arguments feed directly into the idea that horror is limited to jump scares and gore, popcorn movies that provide simple entertainment and cheap thrills. Now, these films do exist, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's 100% okay, and we need those films for entertainment. However, they don't represent the broad scope of horror.
So, what is horror? Now, I am aware that Wikipedia is not always the most reliable source since it could be edited by anyone open to the public. However, its description of horror fiction I found to be the best in terms of a simple consensus. Horror is a film genre that seeks to elicit physical or psychological fear in its viewers. I think we can all pretty much agree that on a basic level that definition checks out and applies to many horror classics such as Poltergeist. Friday the 13th. Or The Exorcist. However, it's the second line of Wikipedia's explanation that really caught my eye. Horror films often explore dark subject matter and may deal with transgressive topics or themes. This assertion seems to be pulled from the Dictionary of Film Studies that describes horror cinema in a similar fashion, adding on other emotions horror evokes, including terror, disgust, shock, and suspense.
So, what can fit under the horror umbrella is a wide array of subjects. I think sometimes when concerning horror, we're too focused on the delivery of the horror and how it's packaged versus the actual substance of the horror. What is it trying to evoke? I'm not trying to imply that the only valid horror is horror with a deeper purpose, or elevated horror, as the internet has labeled it. What I'm saying is everyone should be welcome to the table. Horror films with the simple purpose of terrorizing the audience, and horror with social commentary. Why can't Nope sit at the same table as A Nightmare on Elm Street? However, while, as I've said, horror can look and feel several ways, it should be noted there are some things that shouldn't be considered as horror, or at least not outright. Obviously, for a large number of films, it's not hard to determine that they aren't horror films. The Devil Wears Prada is not a horror film.
One copy. What are my twins gonna do with that? Share?
No, I made 2 copies and had them covered, reset, and bound so that they wouldn't look like manuscripts. This is an extra copy to have in file, just in case.
Honora is not a horror film.
And you are a disgusting hooker. And your son hates you so much he married one to piss you off.
Listen up.
Dude, Where's My Car is not a horror film.
Dude, what does my tattoo say?
Sweet!
What about mine?
Dude, what does mine say?
Sweet! What about mine?
Dude, what does mine say? Sweet!
These types of drama and comedies are far removed from the world of horror. But what about those that teeter on the line of horror? Maybe they have some elements of horror, but not enough for us to feel comfortable grouping them confidently in the horror genre.
I like to refer to these films as horror adjacent. They're not horror media, but they're also not straightforward horror. This conversation is something I see come up every once in a while on the Dead Meat podcast. James and Chelsea will be having a conversation, and one of them will mention a certain movie and ask the other if it's a horror film or not. The other responding that it's in the horror realm, but not necessarily a horror film. I mention this, one, because I love the Dead Meat channels, but also because it seems I'm not the only one who feels as though there is a horror-adjacent category.
For me, my number one example of a horror-adjacent film is Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak. I feel as though to some this film is taken as a horror film, but to others it isn't. I lie somewhere in the middle. Ultimately, I don't think it crosses hard enough into horror territory, but has enough horror elements to be welcome to the horror party.
Crimson Peak tells the story of Edith after her father's abrupt death. With her father now gone, she is taken to England with her new lover, Sir Thomas Sharp, and his sister Lucille. In the end, it is revealed that there was a big scheme orchestrated by Lucille in order to inherit Edith's father's wealth, planning to kill Edith after she is wed to Thomas.
Sounds like a typical drama thriller, right? So, where does the horror conversation come in?
Well, in Del Toro fashion, Edith throughout the film sees ghosts that, might I add, have amazing creature design. She sees the ghost of her deceased mother early on in the film as a child, and then later sees ghosts around the Sharp manor, past victims of the Sharp siblings. Additionally, some could interpret the situation Edith has found herself in as a horror narrative. On that note, I don't necessarily agree. That general plot description is more in the realm of dramas and thrillers. The presence of ghosts also doesn't automatically make something a horror piece. That being said, though, the Del Toro look of these ghosts and how they elicit fear in the audience before we learn of their motive does step into horror territory. But is it enough to make Crimson Peak a straight-up horror movie? I don't think so. The film's narrative doesn't depend on that fear or really have much to do with the ghost. They're just plot devices used in the storytelling. This is what I would say is the hallmark of a horror-adjacent piece. A film with horror elements, but the film doesn't feature those horror elements at the core of the story. Some other examples of films like this are The Silence of the Lambs.
A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Personal Shopper. Coraline.
Why don't we play a game? I know you like them.
Everybody likes games.
Uh-huh.
What kind of game would it be?
An exploring game. A finding things game.
And what is it you'd be finding, Coraline?
And 9.
Don't look in the eyes!
For each of the films I just mentioned, I can already hear the arguments as to why and why not they shouldn't be considered in the horror realm. Which brings me to my next point. Horror is subjective. Horror being subjective is, at least from my viewpoint, something that should be an obvious truth. However, as I continue to see conversations take place online following the release of certain horror films, it has become abundantly clear to me that not everyone thinks that way. I'm not saying this as a dig at anyone who has a more black and white view of horror. It's just an observation.
When I watch a horror movie that didn't scare me personally or evoke much dread, but was still a good movie, I don't write off that movie. The type of horror it included just didn't tug on my personal senses of horror. However, for some, when they don't feel that sense of horror, they deem the movie bad or fail to understand how others could have felt fear, dread, anxiety, or any sense of horror. In other words, disregarding the inherent subjective nature of horror.
Now, when I say horror is subjective, I don't mean that in the same way that some movies are horror films while others aren't, and some are horror adjacent. What I mean is that horror is experienced in different ways, and what each of us find horrifying is different. Some people are startled by jump scares, and others are pretty numb to it. Some feel the suffocating anxiety of a slow burn, while others are bored. We are all scared by different things, and that principle applies to films as well.
Kyle Edward Ball's Skinamarink is a great example of this. The film is extremely polarizing. It genuinely seems as though there is a 50-50 split on you are either utterly terrified by this film or bored out of your mind. If you've seen my Blades Best in Show Awards from 2023, you know that I am in the camp of people who are scared shitless by this movie. But several of my friends did not see where I was coming from. Why? Horror is subjective.
So, all of this being said, where do Longlegs and I Saw the TV Clo fall into place in this complex world of horror? While horror, as I've said, is subjective, these two films to me are undeniably horror films.
Out of the two films, Longlegs is more so accepted as a horror film by the community. While some do find it boring or a letdown, it's hard to deny the horror qualities of the film. I don't necessarily disagree that it's very akin to a crime thriller, but I feel as though the satanic presence in the film pulls it into the horror genre. Not just because it references Satan and the occult, many crime thrillers do that even on TV, but the satanic elements in Longlegs go past mere satanic worship. In the film, it is confirmed that there is concretely supernatural play afoot and that Satan has a legitimate involvement in the spree of murders, among other things. Furthermore, the more we learn about Lee's past and how both she and her mother are related to the crimes is pretty horrific. It goes beyond secrets being kept from Lee. It goes beyond her mother being an accomplice to the crimes. Lee's loose memory on everything is due to some supernatural block placed on her memories, and it is heavily implied that the devil has been looming over Lee her entire life, possibly to the point that she was always fated to end up right where she does at the film's end. There's a very prophetic feeling to the whole ordeal. There are some other elements at play, though, that contributed to the non-horror conversation around Longlegs. Firstly, the film's tone. People felt as though the movie has a slow pace and was more atmospheric, not necessarily inducing a sense of horror. This type of tone can be found in Oz Perkins' other works, such as The Blackcoat's Daughter.
Hello?
I can understand why this slow burn atmospheric approach isn't for all, but it shouldn't diminish the horror qualities of the film. The two films aren't much alike in storytelling or themes, but similar to Lake Mungo, another heavily atmospheric horror film, my favorite horror film by the way, this shouldn't take away the fact that these are horror films. Sure, you're not jumping out of your seat or watching gory kill scenes, but the underlying stories are pure nightmare fuel. Another factor at play was the missteps in the marketing of Longlegs, but that's an entirely separate video of its own.
Maybe Perkins' style just isn't for everyone. Maybe this movie isn't for everyone. But you can't use that argument to say that this is not a horror movie. And I think the same argument goes for I Saw the TV Glow. With I Saw the TV Glow, I can understand a bit more why some don't feel as though it's a horror movie. While normally the ambiguous nature of cosmic horror is unsettling and horrific to the audience, in I Saw the TV Glow, depending on your interpretation of the ambiguous aspects of the story, you may conclude that it's not a horror movie.
As I mentioned earlier, by the film's end, it's not 100% confirmed whether or not Maddie's theory that she and Owen are actually characters from the Pink Opaque stuck in this reality is true or not. For those who interpret the film's ending that they aren't and Maddie has just gone off the rails, the film could be seen as a creepy, stylistic drama that's horror adjacent but not a horror movie. However, the other interpretation of her theory being real paints an entirely different narrative that makes the story undeniably a horror tale.
However, I don't find that either interpretation is what makes or breaks this film as a piece of horror media. It's what the story represents.
Personally, I do find that the possibility of them being stuck in this reality as some sort of imprisonment from the Pink Opaque's antagonists is enough to fit the story in the horror genre. That's a horrifying situation to be in. But the deeper meaning of I Saw the TV Glow is where the true horror comes into play. The horror of being a queer person. I Saw the TV Glow is an artistic look at the suffocation many queer people experience having to suppress their true identities or aspects of themselves. Throughout the film, it's clear that our protagonist Owen is not fully happy with himself, unfulfilled. This doesn't get resolved by the film's conclusion either, as we see Owen express disdain over the domestic life he has chosen. This disdain finally boils over in one of the film's final scenes where Owen screams, "Help me, I'm dying." This scene can be very confusing when taking the film literally at face value, but when you contextualize it with the film's queer themes, it becomes very clear what's happened here. Owen has lived his whole life suffocating himself and his ambiguous queer identity, and now he is in the later half of his life, too late to truly express himself, locked in the confines of his domestic and traditional life. That's horrifying.
I know this video went a bit all over the place before I got back to the two films at hand, but I think that showcases my point that the world of horror is vast and what can fit under its umbrella is far-reaching. Rather than rejecting horror that's trying new things or doesn't appeal to your personal sense of horror, we should embrace them for putting something new on the table. Besides, you don't have to necessarily like something to respect what it is. For this video, since there's two films at hand, I'm going to keep my reviews of each film pretty brief, but I'll of course put my full reviews on Letterboxd. So, Longlegs is classic Oz Perkins with a crime drama twist that'll keep you guessing until almost the very end. I give Longlegs a 4 out of 5. I Saw the TV Glow is a visionary work with a unique aesthetic that paints a suffocating yet accurate look at being queer. I give I Saw the TV Glow a 5 out of 5. So, what did you think of these two films, and what are some of your favorite horror-adjacent movies? That's all I have to say for this installment of Let's Talk About, and I'll see you next time where I'll be discussing a film that definitely did its homework on a long-standing internet urban legend. I'll see you next time. Longlegs is a 2024 film directed by Oz Perkins and distributed by Neon. The film follows Agent Owen and Maddie bond over a seemingly niche teen horror series titled The Pink Opaque. Maddie... So, what can fit under the horror... Oh my god, that's a hard little thing to say. So, What could fit under the horror umbrella is a why or rate. Oh my, that is a weird sentence. I did this to myself. For me, my number one example of a horror-adjacent film is Horror being subjective, at least from my viewpoint, should be an obvious truth. However, as I continue